Mary Mallon had no idea she was dangerous. She was a cook, a woman making a living in the bustling kitchens of New York at the turn of the 20th century. To those who knew her, she was just another hardworking woman, strong and capable, serving up meals in private homes and restaurants. She was someone who appeared to be healthy, living her life with little concern. There were no symptoms of illness, no fever, no pain. She was lively and energetic, doing the work she loved. Yet, Mary Mallon was a walking time bomb, and she carried a secret inside her body, one that she had no way of knowing would ultimately turn her into an unwitting executioner. She was lethal without even realizing it. Mary was what doctors would later call a healthy carrier of typhoid fever, a concept that was difficult for people to grasp at the time. The bacteria that caused typhoid fever lived inside her, multiplying and thriving in her body, yet Mary never felt its effects. She was seemingly immune, never suffering the same consequences that others did when infected. But as she moved from one kitchen to the next, cooking for families and serving meals, she left a trail of sickness and death in her wake. Wherever Mary went, outbreaks followed. It wasn't immediate, but over time, homes would go from being perfectly healthy to suffering outbreaks of high fever, diarrhea, and sometimes death. The connection between her and the outbreaks was not immediately obvious. In fact, it was completely unthinkable at first. Typhoid fever was well known by the turn of the century, but people assumed it was spread by contaminated water or spoiled food. No one suspected a perfectly healthy-looking woman, someone who never showed any signs of illness, could be carrying and spreading the bacteria. It wasn't until 1906, when a determined investigator named George Soper was called to investigate a series of typhoid outbreaks, that the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. Soper had been hired by a wealthy New York family after they had suffered an outbreak of typhoid fever while on vacation. The family's water supply was clean, and the food they ate was fresh. But when Soper began looking into the situation further, he noticed something strange. Every household that had suffered from the outbreak had one thing in common: Mary Mallon had worked as the cook at each location. Soper's findings led him to track down Mary, hoping to explain the situation to her. When he found her, he tried to explain that she had unknowingly been spreading the disease. But Mary refused to believe him. In her mind, she had done nothing wrong. She had never been sick herself. So how could she possibly be the cause of others' illnesses? The very idea seemed absurd to her. To be accused of causing sickness when she felt perfectly fine was insulting. She had always worked hard, cooking meals for families, and she had never seen herself as a criminal. Mary refused to cooperate, rejecting the idea of being tested. She viewed Soper as a lunatic who was trying to ruin her life. The health officials were persistent, though. They understood the gravity of the situation. Eventually, they forced Mary to undergo tests, and the results shocked even the doctors. Mary Mallon's body was swarming with typhoid bacteria. She wasn't just carrying the disease, she was a carrier who was spreading it to those around her without any ill effects on herself. The doctors told Mary that she could no longer work as a cook. She was a danger to the people she served, and her continued employment in kitchens would result in more outbreaks. But Mary didn't accept their conclusions. She didn't understand what the doctors were saying, and she still refused to believe that she had done anything wrong. She felt targeted, as though she were being accused of a crime she didn't even know she had committed. Faced with the fact that Mary would not cooperate, authorities took drastic action. In 1907, she was forcibly quarantined on North Brother Island, a small and isolated island in New York's East River. For 3 years, Mary was cut off from the outside world. She lived as a prisoner, not for a crime she had committed, but because of the bacteria that lived inside her. She became a medical curiosity, the first known case of a healthy carrier of typhoid fever. Scientists studied her, tested her, and begged her to change professions. But Mary never accepted their conclusions. She was convinced that she had done nothing wrong, and she never saw herself as the cause of anyone's suffering. After 3 years of isolation, public pressure led to Mary's release. She was allowed to leave North Brother Island, but under one condition: she had to promise never to work as a cook again. Mary agreed, but she didn't stay away from the kitchens for long. She changed her name, found a new job, and was back to cooking in a matter of months. Cooking paid better than other jobs, and she was good at it. She couldn't resist the temptation to return to a profession that had been so familiar to her, even though it meant putting others at risk. For 5 years, Mary managed to avoid detection. She worked in various kitchens, leaving a trail of illness behind her. Then, in 1915, disaster struck. An outbreak of typhoid fever occurred in a New York hospital, resulting in 25 people falling ill and 1 person dying. Health officials investigated the source of the outbreak and quickly discovered that the hospital's cook had been working under a false name. But they knew exactly who she was. Mary Mallon had returned to her old ways, ignoring the promise she had made and continuing to spread the disease wherever she worked. This time, authorities were determined to stop her for good. There would be no second chance. Mary was sent back to North Brother Island, where she would spend the rest of her life in quarantine. She lived in a small cottage, surrounded by doctors and nurses, and occasionally interviewed by journalists eager to speak with the woman who had become infamous as Typhoid Mary. Mary Mallon never admitted guilt. Until her death in 1938, she insisted that she had done nothing wrong. She never understood the science behind her condition, never accepted that she was the cause of so much suffering. In her mind, she was a victim, not a criminal. She had been unlucky enough to carry a disease that she didn't even know existed inside her. The history books remember Mary Mallon differently. However, her story is one of tragedy, of science that was still in its infancy, and of how little was understood about disease transmission at the time. Mary became a symbol of the dangers posed by those who unknowingly carry diseases, and her case changed the way we think about public health. Typhoid Mary was the first known healthy carrier, but she wasn't the last. Her story led to changes in how outbreaks were handled and how health officials tracked the spread of disease. It also forced the medical community to reconsider the way they treated individuals who carried diseases without showing symptoms. Was Mary Mallon guilty? Was she a villain? Or was she simply a woman born with a body that carried death without her knowledge? No trial was ever held. And no sentence was passed in a courtroom. But for all intents and purposes, Mary Mallon was convicted of a crime no one had ever seen before, being a threat without intent. For that, she paid with her freedom, and the rest of her life.